Year 1944, Europe was burning. Across the muddy roads of war-torn France, the air hung thick with smoke, fear and silence. The kind of silence that comes after everything familiar has been taken away. Through that silence marched a group of British women. Nurses, radio operators, and volunteers, now prisoners of war, their uniforms torn, faces pale and spirits trembling. They were led through barbed wire gates into an enemy camp they'd only heard about in nightmares. To them, capture meant cruelty. They'd heard stories whispered in foxholes of starvation, punishment, and despair. As the gates clanged shut behind them, many closed their eyes, bracing for the worst. But what awaited them inside was something no one could have imagined. The camp kitchen, a place of routine for the enemy soldiers, became the stage for a story that defied everything they knew about war. In the midst of fear and suspicion, the smell of freshly baked bread drifted through the morning fog. Pots clattered, fire crackled, and for the first time since their capture, the British women looked up confused, cautious, and utterly speechless. This is the forgotten story of humanity behind the wire, where hunger met compassion, and enemies found themselves face to face with the unthinkable. The year was 1944. The world had become a battlefield without borders, from the shattered ruins of Normandy to the frozen edges of Eastern Europe. War had devoured everything it touched, and somewhere behind the front lines, far from the echo of artillery, a small convoy wound its way through a forest road lined with blackened trees. Inside a rickety truck sat a group of British women, former army nurses, communication officers and field aides. Their hands bound loosely, their uniforms covered in the dust of surrender. The truck's engine groaned as it climbed the final hill toward the camp. None of the women spoke. The rhythmic rattle of chains and the hum of the motor filled the air like a dirge. One woman, Margaret, clutched a rosary hidden in her sleeve. Another, Ellen, stared through the slats in the truck bed, watching the grey outline of guard towers rise through the morning fog. Every mile brought them closer to what they believed would be a place of humiliation and hunger. A camp where they would be stripped of dignity and left to fade away. The guards escorting them were quiet, their boots crunched over the gravel, their breath visible in the cold. They were not cruel, but their silence carried its own kind of fear. When the gate finally opened with a metallic groan, the women stepped down one by one, blinking at the sight before them. Rows of low wooden huts, smoke curling from chimneys, a field surrounded by barbed wire. Everything smelled of earth, fire, and boiled cabbage. Margaret's first thought was simple, so this is where it ends. The women were led across the yard toward a large structure near the far fence. Its roof sagged with age, and the air around it shimmered with heat. It was the kitchen, though calling it that felt almost absurd in a place like this. Inside they expected darkness, the stench of rot, the bark of orders. But as the door creaked open, something unexpected struck them. Warmth. Not metaphorical warmth, but the physical kind that wraps itself around cold bones. Steam rose from large iron pots. The fire crackled beneath them, its glow painting the walls gold. A few enemy cooks moved methodically, stirring, pouring, chopping. None looked up at first. The sound of a ladle striking metal echoed softly. It was not the chaos of cruelty the women had imagined. It was order, rhythm, almost normalcy. Ellen caught the scent first, something earthy and familiar. Soup. Thick, heavy, honest soup. Her stomach twisted in response. She hadn't smelled real food in days. The guards motioned for the women to sit on benches lined along a wooden table. The women hesitated. Sitting felt too comfortable, too undeserved. But the guards insisted quietly. No shouting, no threats, just a gesture. Sit. One of the cooks, a middle-aged man with a face reddened by the stove's heat, ladled the soup into dented tin bowls. He moved slowly down the line, placing one before each woman. The liquid steamed, dotted with bits of vegetables and barley. For a moment, no one touched it. Margaret gripped the bowl as though it might disappear if she blinked. Ellen's fingers trembled. Another woman whispered, "It's a trick." The guard closest to them, a man no older than 25, simply nodded toward the bowls. "Eat," he said, his voice flat. "It's hot." That was it. No laughter, no mockery. Just that one word. The women looked at each other. Finally, Margaret raised the spoon to her lips. The taste was simple but real: salt, warmth, a faint sweetness of carrots. She blinked rapidly, unable to stop the tears that gathered in her eyes. It wasn't just hunger that broke her composure. It was the shocking reminder of what being cared for felt like. Around her, spoons began to clink softly. No one spoke. The only sounds were the simmering of the pot and the faint hiss of the fire. The kitchen, for those few minutes, felt suspended in another world, one untouched by gunfire or ideology. Ellen stared at the cooks. Their uniforms were stained, their faces tired, but there was something else: restraint, decency. One of them briefly met her eyes. He didn't smile, but there was something human there, something unspoken. They were enemies, yet both seemed to acknowledge the absurdity of it all. Outside, snow began to fall, light, hesitant flakes drifting through the cracks in the roof. The women huddled closer, hands wrapped around the bowls for warmth. Someone coughed. Someone else laughed quietly, almost afraid to break the silence. Margaret whispered, "I thought they'd make us beg." Ellen didn't reply. She just stared at the rising steam and wondered how kindness could exist here, in this forgotten corner of cruelty. It unsettled her more than anger ever could. The meal ended quickly. The bowls were collected. A guard gestured for them to stand. As they filed out, the women glanced back. The cooks were already cleaning, moving on to the next duty as if nothing unusual had happened. But to the prisoners, that moment, that brief act of feeding them without ridicule, felt monumental. That night, in the cramped barracks, the women whispered about it. Some refused to believe it had been genuine. Others clung to it desperately, like a spark in the dark. Margaret said, "Maybe they're not all monsters." Someone else replied, "Don't start hoping." But hope had already crept in, quiet, unwanted, impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, the routine repeated. Each morning they were marched to the kitchen. Each time the same calm, the same ritual of nourishment. There was no conversation, no camaraderie, only the silent recognition that both sides were trapped in the same machinery of war. For the women, the kitchen became a strange sanctuary. The sound of boiling water, the scent of bread, the rhythm of work, all reminders of life before uniforms and walls. They learned the faces of their captors, the older cook with the scar near his ear, the young assistant who whistled softly as he stirred the pot, the officer who always stood near the door, arms folded, watching but never interfering. And each time they sat, disbelief returned. The food was never luxurious, but it was enough, and in war enough was everything. On the seventh day, Ellen mustered the courage to say, "Thank you," under her breath as the bowl was placed before her. The cook paused for the briefest moment. His hand twitched, his jaw tightened. Then he nodded once and moved on. No one dared to speak of it after. Words felt dangerous, as if gratitude itself might be misunderstood, but the feeling lingered, a fragile, invisible thread stretching between prisoner and guard. Outside, the war raged on. As the days wore on, the British women began to notice patterns, small rituals that at first seemed insignificant, but slowly revealed a layer of unexpected care. Each morning, when they were marched into the kitchen, they expected the rigid, militaristic efficiency of prisoners being fed. A hurried shove toward bowls, whispered commands, sharp gestures of impatience. Instead, they found a calm, deliberate rhythm. Pots were heated on fires that crackled just so. Vegetables were chopped evenly, not hastily. Bread was placed at the center of each tray in neat portions. Even the simplest act of preparing a meal, something the women had once done in domestic kitchens with laughter and chatter, had a precision here that seemed almost reverent. At first, they thought it was merely procedural. Perhaps the cooks had their own strict rules, and the prisoners happened to fall into them. But then the gestures became personal. When a woman looked particularly thin, a cook would push an extra piece of bread toward her without a word. When the soup ran low, another would scoop from the larger pot to make sure no one's portion was short. These acts were quiet, fleeting, invisible to anyone not paying close attention. But for the women, they were profound. In a world dominated by suspicion and fear, where survival often depended on cunning and self-preservation, here was an example of someone acting without expectation of reward or reprisal. The young nurse, Alice, was the first to whisper about it. "It's as if they're trying to see us as people," she said one evening as they returned to their barracks. The others nodded, though some remained cautious, unwilling to admit that perhaps their captors were not entirely cruel. They had been taught to expect the worst, to mistrust every gesture of kindness, and yet every morning they were fed. Every morning they received sustenance and, with it, a subtle reminder of their own humanity. The women began to observe more closely. One cook had a habit of wiping his hands carefully on a rag before handling each bowl, even though the rag itself was threadbare and stained. Another would arrange the bowls symmetrically on the long wooden table, as though the order itself carried meaning. And while they never spoke to the prisoners directly, their glances were not hostile. Occasionally, a fleeting smile would appear when a woman met a cook's eyes, brief, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. It was a language without words, a silent acknowledgement that despite the uniform, despite the barbed wire, there was still a shared recognition of life, of struggle, of survival. As the week progressed, the women found themselves anticipating these moments. The kitchen, once a place of anxiety, became a space of subtle comfort. The act of being fed properly, the care evident in how the meals were prepared and served, became a small anchor in their daily lives. Even when outside the camp the world remained chaotic, inside this kitchen, order prevailed. This paradox, being prisoners yet treated with care, created a tension that none of them could fully reconcile. How could human beings, trained for conflict, capable of violence, also demonstrate such restraint, such compassion? The guards, too, played a role, though indirectly. They moved about with quiet authority, ensuring that the women were safe as they ate, yet without the overbearing control they had initially feared. One guard would linger near the stove, adjusting the fire with practiced hands. Another would glance toward the barracks before the women were seated, a silent signal that all was in order. The women noticed, and in those small details, a sense of trust, fragile and cautious, began to grow. During these moments, the women reflected on what they had lost. Back home, the kitchen was a place of comfort and life, filled with chatter, laughter, and the smells of familiar meals. Here, the kitchen had been transformed into something sacred, not because it was luxurious or inviting, but because it represented a rare constancy amidst chaos. The simple acts of chopping, stirring, and serving became a bridge between two sides of the war. Captor and captive, enemy and human. Even the children of the camp, when they appeared briefly at the edges of the kitchen yard, brought an additional layer of wonder. The innocence mirrored the simple decency of the meals. Sometimes, a cook would slip a small piece of bread to a girl or boy, and though the British women had been trained to see the enemy as faceless and cruel, these small acts shattered the barrier of expectation. Humanity, they realized, was not defined by uniform allegiance or ideology. It was reflected in small, deliberate gestures. Alice noticed a pattern in the way the cooks worked together. One would prepare the vegetables, another would manage the fire, while a third arranged bowls on the table. It was a choreography, a quiet ballet of service and attention to detail. The women found themselves studying it with fascination. Each movement, each gesture spoke of thought, of effort, of something deeper than mere obligation. It was a respect that was never verbalized, a protocol of care that transcended language, nationality, and even war itself. Evenings brought reflection. Back in the barracks, the women discussed the subtle acts of kindness that had marked their days. A loaf of bread given quietly, a bowl of soup with extra vegetables, a watchful eye ensuring that no one was neglected. Each instance carried weight, a reminder that not all humanity had been lost in the inferno of conflict. They began to write in their journals, not only documenting the cruelty they had seen, but also the rare and unexpected moments of decency. For some, the act of recording it was itself a small rebellion against despair. Margaret, who had once believed that capture meant only suffering, began to understand that human behavior could not always be predicted, even in war. She marveled at the fact that these simple meals, prepared and served without complaint or derision, had the power to restore something essential: dignity. She began to notice how the other women reacted in subtle ways, shoulders relaxing, eyes lifting from the floor, small smiles appearing at the edges of lips. Even without words, the shared experience fostered a quiet sense of community, bridging the gap between fear and tentative trust. The women also began to observe the limits of this kindness. It was never forced, never performed for praise. It existed within the framework of the camp's strict rules, constrained by the realities of wartime scarcity. Yet, within these boundaries, every small gesture carried an emotional weight that far exceeded its practical value. A crust of bread could feel like a treasure. A ladle of soup could feel like salvation. The women measured the generosity not by quantity, but by the intent behind it, the deliberate care that each cook invested in every action. As winter deepened, the weather grew harsh, with biting winds cutting across the barbed wire. The kitchen became even more vital, a sanctuary from the cold, from the fear outside, from the uncertainty of survival. The warmth of the fire, the rhythmic clatter of pots, and the comforting smell of food formed a protective cocoon. Each morning, as the women stepped inside, the sense of disbelief returned. How could such care exist in a place defined by imprisonment? How could these human beings, trained for war and indoctrinated into ideology, show such restraint? These questions lingered unspoken, but each answer arrived in the form of a bowl, a loaf. A ladle moved with precision. Eventually, even the most skeptical women began to relax, to allow themselves a small measure of trust. They learned to anticipate the routine, to understand the unspoken choreography of care, and to accept the sustenance with a mixture of gratitude and astonishment. The kitchen became a symbol, not only of survival, but of the unexpected capacity for humanity to persist even in the most unlikely places. The acts were quiet, ephemeral, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, yet for the women, they were transformative. They began to speak in hushed tones about what they had witnessed, about how small kindnesses could ripple outward, altering perception and sustaining hope. They saw it in each other's eyes. In the subtle straightening of posture, the hesitant but genuine smile, the momentary pause of contemplation before a spoonful of soup was lifted, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, disbelief gave way to understanding. These gestures were not miraculous, they were human. They were ordinary people, caught in the machinery of war, performing extraordinary acts simply because they could. The women began to grasp that kindness did not require permission, rank, or allegiance. It required only attention, care, and the courage to act even when doing so was unnecessary, unnoticed, or dangerous. Through the repetition of days, the kitchen became a sanctuary of both physical nourishment and emotional sustenance. It was a place where hunger was assuaged and fear was momentarily suspended. It was a place where the women could reclaim a fragment of their former selves, stripped away by the chaos of war, and glimpse the humanity that survived even behind barbed wire and steel gates. By the end of the second week, a silent rhythm had been established. The women moved with the certainty of routine, and the cooks continued their quiet, deliberate work. The cycle of nourishment, observation, and reflection continued, reinforcing the extraordinary paradox at the heart of the camp, that even in captivity, kindness could endure. And for the British women, this revelation became a beacon, fragile, fleeting, but unbreakable in its significance. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, the camp seemed to close in on the prisoners. The chill crept into every corner of the wooden huts, making the women huddle together for warmth. Outside, the wind cut across the open fields, carrying with it the scent of smoke and frozen earth. The barbed wire glistened with frost, and the distant hills appeared like shadowed ghosts against the grey sky. For the British women, survival had become a rhythm of endurance, waking, marching, waiting, and eating, each act mechanical, practiced, and fraught with anxiety. Yet, within the walls of the camp kitchen, the impossible had begun to take shape, an enduring, almost inexplicable kindness that transcended the brutality surrounding them. The women noticed, first in small ways and later in more pronounced gestures, that their captors seemed to have made a conscious decision to maintain a certain standard for them, even when the camp itself suffered shortages. Rations for the guards were often meager, fires sputtered, ingredients ran low, yet the prisoners' portions were always maintained, and sometimes even improved. A bowl of stew might contain an extra carrot or potato. Bread was portioned evenly, never skipped. There was no grand gesture, no flourish of generosity, only a quiet, deliberate attentiveness, as if someone had decided that these women, unlike other prisoners, deserved a measure of dignity. Eleanor, a young nurse with eyes rimmed from exhaustion, noticed one night as she received her bowl of soup that the fire beneath the stove had been stoked longer than usual. The heat radiated farther into the cold kitchen, brushing against her numb fingers. She looked up to see the cook, a man perhaps older than the others, wiping sweat from his brow. His eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, and in that glance she felt acknowledgement, not pity, not superiority, but recognition of her existence, her humanity. She whispered under her breath, almost to herself, "They're feeding us like we're human again." The words startled her, carrying the weight of disbelief, relief, and profound gratitude all at once. The effect of this sustained, understated care went beyond physical nourishment. It seeped into their minds and hearts, reshaping the way they perceived their environment. The camp, which had been a place of fear, barbed wire, and surveillance, became a paradoxical space, a world in which war's cruelty was always present, yet shadowed by moments of unanticipated grace. Each meal became a ritual, a subtle assertion of normalcy in a place that had stripped away so much. The women began to anticipate these small gestures of decency, leaning into them as one might cling to a fragile lifeline amid a storm. With the passage of weeks, the kitchen's quiet warmth became emblematic of a larger truth. Even in captivity, amid the machinery of war, humanity could endure. The British women came to see their captors not as faceless enemies, but as individuals capable of choice, capable of restraint. This realization did not erase the violence that had defined their capture, nor did it diminish the suffering surrounding them, but it provided a counterpoint, a proof that kindness could persist even in the harshest conditions. One afternoon, a severe shortage of flour caused tension among the cooks. They whispered among themselves, glancing occasionally toward the prisoners. The women, expecting their portions to shrink, were surprised to see the usual measure of bread placed before each of them. Even as the camp tightened its belt, the prisoners' meals remained consistent. It was not merely sustenance, it was a message, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were to be preserved, not neglected. For some of the women, the realization brought tears, for it underscored both the rarity and the significance of this quiet humanity. Long nights in the barracks were filled with reflection. Some women wrote in tattered journals, documenting the paradoxes of life behind the wire. They recorded the meticulous care of the cooks, the warmth of the fire in the kitchen, and the small glances that conveyed acknowledgement without words. Margaret wrote of the way the steam from the bowls twisted in the pale morning light, catching the corners of the women's eyes and illuminating a fleeting moment of serenity. Alice sketched in her mind the subtle choreography of preparation. The ladle dipping into the pot, the bread being placed with deliberate precision, the careful arrangement of bowls along the wooden table. These images, though mundane to the observers outside the camp, carried immense weight for those who had endured the relentless anxiety of imprisonment. The camp's hierarchy added another layer of complexity to these observations. Officers and guards who enforced discipline elsewhere seemed to adopt a different code in the kitchen. The women never learned whether this was due to personal conscience, an order from above, or sheer pragmatism. Yet the result was undeniable. A space where fear receded, where careful attention replaced threat, and where the act of feeding the prisoners became an almost sacred ritual. Each morning, as they were led into the kitchen, the women experienced a fragile equilibrium, a balance between expectation and hope, between caution and trust. Even in moments of scarcity or crisis, the acts of kindness persisted. When the firewood dwindled during a particularly harsh cold snap, the kitchen staff worked in tandem to keep the stoves burning, ensuring that the meals remained hot and that the women were shielded from the bitter temperatures. The prisoners noticed these efforts, sometimes in silence, sometimes through small, appreciative glances. There was no overt acknowledgement, no breaking of protocol, but the women understood that these gestures were intentional. They were deliberate acts of care, performed not for recognition, but because someone chose to uphold a standard of decency in the midst of deprivation. As the weeks stretched into months, the cumulative effect of these daily rituals became clear. The women, though still captives, began to experience a sense of continuity, a thread of stability amidst the chaos. The kitchen, with its simple meals and quiet attention, provided more than nourishment. It offered a semblance of normal life. The consistency of care, the deliberate preservation of dignity, and the recognition of their humanity left an indelible mark on their psyche. It created a foundation of resilience, allowing them to endure the larger horrors surrounding them without losing their sense of self entirely. The memory of these meals persisted in subtle ways. In the evenings, as snow fell softly across the camp, the women would recall the warmth of the kitchen, the smell of simmering stew, the careful attention of the cooks, and the unspoken acknowledgement of their existence. These memories were deeply private, sometimes shared in whispered conversations with each other, sometimes preserved silently within the mind's quiet corridors. They became symbols of a complex truth. Even in the darkest of human experiences, moments of grace could exist, and recognition of one's humanity could survive amidst cruelty. One particularly bitter night, a young British nurse noticed a cook quietly placing a slice of bread aside, seemingly for no reason. Later, she saw that it had been set for a woman whose hands were trembling with cold. That simple gesture, unnoticed by most, unnoticed even by her captors, encapsulated the extraordinary paradox of the camp. Even amidst war, scarcity, and fear, compassion could manifest in small, deliberate acts. These gestures were neither performative nor coerced. They were expressions of choice, quietly defying the brutal expectations of the surrounding world. As winter began to recede and the days grew longer, the women reflected on the lessons they had unconsciously absorbed. They had come to understand that humanity was neither uniform nor predictable, that cruelty and kindness could coexist in the same space, performed by the same individuals. The kitchen had become more than a place of physical sustenance. It was a crucible for emotional survival, a testament to the resilience of human decency. Even decades later, many of these women would recall the warmth of the kitchen, the quiet attentiveness of the cooks, and the subtle dignity afforded to them despite their captivity. The memory of being treated with care, fed properly, and acknowledged as human became a defining experience, a story of hope interwoven with the harsh realities of war. It was a paradox that would forever linger in their minds, a reminder that even in the bleakest circumstances, small acts of kindness could leave an enduring impression, shaping not only their survival, but their understanding of humanity itself.